The lawyer had a kind face. I remember that. He had the face of someone who had practiced looking sympathetic. Soft eyes, a slight downward tilt of the head when he spoke. He said my mother's name like he had known her. He hadn't. None of them had. I had been the one who knew her. I had been the one who cleaned the bathroom after the bad nights, who learned what her silences meant, which ones were pain, and which ones were exhaustion, and which ones were grief for a version of herself she was letting go of, piece by piece. I was the one who could tell the difference. What nobody knew, not even me, not yet, was that while I was learning the difference between her silences, my brother had been learning something else entirely. I'm going to tell you exactly what I found out, and I'm going to tell you exactly what I did about it. I should start with what I was before any of this. Not because I want your sympathy. I don't particularly, but because you need to understand what I gave up in order to understand what was taken from me. I was 32 when my mother called to tell me they had found something on the scan. I was in the middle of a meeting. I remember the fluorescent light above the conference table. I remember the PowerPoint still projected on the wall, a bar chart in corporate blue. I stepped outside and stood in the hallway and listened to her describe a tumor the size of a walnut in language that was too calm, too composed, and I understood immediately that she had already been sitting with this information for some time before she called me. She had needed time to find the right words. That was my mother, always protecting me from the worst of it. My brother Daniel lived 20 minutes from my mother. He had lived 20 minutes from her for 9 years. He had a flexible schedule. He worked in sales, not the kind that requires you to be anywhere specific at any specific time. He had 2 kids, who my mother adored, who she would talk about with this particular softness in her voice that I always found quietly painful to listen to, though I never said so. When I drove to my mother's house that first weekend after the diagnosis, Daniel was there. He sat across the kitchen table from me and we talked about treatment plans and doctors' names and logistics, and he used the word "we" a lot. We'll figure this out. We'll make sure she has everything she needs. We're going to get through this. And I felt something warm when he said it. I believed him. I want you to know that. I believed him completely. Within 8 weeks, it became clear that my mother needed more than weekend visits. She needed someone there. Not occasionally. Consistently. I was the one who moved in. I told Marcus it would be temporary. I said 6 months, maybe 8. He was generous about it. Genuinely, not performatively. He helped me pack a bag. He said he would drive down on weekends. He did. For a while. My company allowed me to go remote. I worked from my mother's kitchen table for the first year. Laptop open on one end, her medication schedule written on a notepad on the other. I learned the names of every nurse at the oncology clinic. I learned which pharmacists stayed late on Thursdays. I learned what my mother could eat during chemo weeks. And what made her nauseous. And which position she needed the pillow in when the pain was worst at night. Daniel visited at Christmas that first year. He stayed for 4 days. He brought wine and a gift basket from a shop near his house, the kind with chocolates and jam and a small candle. My mother's eyes lit up when he walked through the door. She had this way of looking at him. I can't describe it except to say it was the way people look at something they are relieved still exists. He called every Sunday. He called every Sunday, and I know because I could hear her side of the conversation through the kitchen wall. And she always laughed during those calls. That real laugh. not the managed one she used with doctors and neighbors. After she hung up, she would tell me what he said, what the kids were doing, something funny that happened at his house. And I would say, "That's lovely, Mom." And mean it. Mostly. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not just from the physical work of caregiving, but from the specific ache of being invisible in it, of doing the unglamorous work, the 3 a.m. work, the documentation work, the pharmacy dispute work, and feeling that none of it counted in quite the same way as a phone call on Sunday afternoons. I didn't understand yet why that was. I would. The second year was harder. The illness changed, and my mother changed with it. Not in who she was, but in what she could manage. There were more difficult nights, more decisions I had to make alone at hours when there was no one else to ask. Marcus and I argued more over the phone. Small arguments about nothing that were really one large argument about everything. He moved out of our apartment 18 months in. He said he didn't want to, but that he couldn't keep living with someone who was half present. I understood. I didn't say so then, but I understood. I kept going. There was a Tuesday. I remember it was a Tuesday because the recycling trucks came, when my mother had a particularly bad morning, and I sat on the bathroom floor next to her for a long time afterward. And she held my hand and said, "You are the strongest person I have ever known." And I thought, I hope this means something. I held on to that. I kept going. Daniel came for the third Christmas. Then he stopped coming for Christmas. He had reasons, always reasons. The kids had activities, his wife's family had made plans. The drive was long and the timing didn't work. And by the time I thought to push back on any of it, somehow months had passed, and I had simply stopped expecting him. He called on Sundays, then every other Sunday. And I stopped tracking it, because I had more important things to track. My mother never said anything critical about him to me. I want to be precise about this. She did not complain about his absence, not once. She protected him from that, the same way she had always protected the people she loved from the worst of what she was thinking. What she did instead was ask me, sometimes with a particular careful tone, whether Daniel and I spoke much, whether I had talked to him lately. And there was something in the way she asked it that I didn't examine closely enough at the time. I should have examined it more closely. By year 4, it was just us. My mother's world had become small. Her bedroom, the kitchen, the garden on good days. My world had become exactly the same size. I had lost most of the professional connections I had spent my 30s building. My social life had narrowed to the point of almost nothing. I was 41. Sometimes in the morning before my mother woke up, I would make coffee and stand at the kitchen window and try to remember who I had been before this house. And find that the image came back slowly, like a photograph left in the sun too long. I am not telling you this to make you pity me. I am telling you because I need you to understand what the accounting actually was, what was deposited and what was withdrawn, and by whom. Because later, much later, someone was going to tell me that this was my choice, that I had chosen to be here, and that choice didn't entitle me to anything. I need you to already know the numbers before we get there. It was during the 4th year that I found the first thing. I was helping my mother organize some papers. She had become increasingly anxious about her documents being in order, which I now understand differently. And I found, tucked inside a folder of old correspondence, a handwritten letter from a solicitor. The date on it was 3 years earlier. It was brief. It confirmed a meeting. It referenced a codicil to her will. I put it back. I didn't ask. I told myself it was her right to manage her own estate, and I had no business looking at it. And I believed myself. Mostly. But the word codicil sat in the back of my mind in the quiet moments. A codicil is not a will. A codicil is a change to a will. She died in the early hours of a Thursday morning in November. I was with her. I was holding her hand. The room was warm and dark, and the only sound was the rain outside the window. I don't have more to say about that moment. Some things belong only to the person who was there. Daniel arrived at the house at noon that day. He had driven from his house. He came in and he put his arms around me in the hallway. And we stood there for a long time. He cried. I didn't. Not then. I had been crying intermittently for 6 years. And I think by that point, my body didn't have a distinct response left for the final moment. I just felt still. Like a room where all the furniture had been removed. The funeral was 11 days later. Daniel spoke. He gave a eulogy. He had always been the better public speaker of the two of us. Easier with words in a room full of people. He talked about her laugh. He talked about Sunday phone calls. He talked about what she had meant to him and his kids. People cried. It was a good eulogy. I sat in the front pew and I listened. And I thought, he is not lying. He did love her. That was never the question. The will reading was 3 weeks after the funeral. I drove there alone. I had not looked at the letter again. I had not asked Daniel anything. I had not called the solicitor. I had simply carried those 3 weeks in the way I had carried all the other weeks. One at a time. Forward. He read my mother's name and her date of birth and the formal preamble of the document. And then he began reading the specific bequests. And I sat with my hands folded in my lap, listening. And I heard Daniel's name receive the house, the investment account, and the majority of the estate. And I heard my name receive a sum that was less than 1 year of the income I had sacrificed. And I sat there in that chair, with the kind-faced lawyer's voice continuing to move through the document. And I felt nothing. At first, nothing. Just the fluorescent sound of an air conditioning unit somewhere above me. Then slowly, like something being poured into a glass, I felt it. The memory of the bathroom floor. I drove home to my apartment, which I had moved back into after my mother died. And I sat in my car in the parking structure for a very long time. And I didn't cry. I had expected to. But what came instead was something I had never felt quite so cleanly before. I have tried to find the right word for it. Clarity is close. Inventory is also close. It was the feeling of finally looking at a room with all the lights on and seeing exactly what is in it. No more adjusting to the dark. No more walking carefully around shapes you could only half see. I started noticing things I had never noticed before. I requested copies of my mother's financial documents through the estate process. Routine, my solicitor said. Just paperwork. I was not searching for anything specific. I was simply reading. And what I found, when I read carefully, was that the codicil had been drafted 14 months before my mother died. 14 months, during which she had seen me every single day, during which she had held my hand and said I was the strongest person she had ever known. 14 months, in which she never once mentioned it. I found something else. The investment account, the one left to Daniel, had received a significant deposit 3 months before the codicil was signed. A transfer from a source I recognized. A joint account my mother and Daniel had held together for years, which I had not known existed, which I had never been told about. Neither of them had mentioned it. Not once. In 6 years. I started saying less. I watched more. Daniel called me 2 weeks after the will reading. He said he wanted to talk. He said he understood this was hard. He said my mother had loved me deeply, and he hoped I knew that. He used the word equitable. He said he thought my mother had tried to be equitable, given that I had chosen to be there, and he had had family obligations. He said chosen. He said it carefully, the way someone says a word they have been rehearsing. I heard the rehearsal in it. I said, I understand. I'm not angry, Daniel. I just need some time. He sounded relieved. He said that was completely understandable. He said he hoped we could still be close. I let him believe exactly what he wanted to believe. I met with my solicitor the following week. Not to contest the will. You cannot easily contest a will from a competent adult. And my mother, whatever she did, had been of sound mind. What I wanted to know was something more specific. I wanted to know everything. I wanted the full picture, completely lit. It took 6 weeks. My solicitor was thorough. She is that kind of person, blessedly. What emerged, documented and precise, was this. The joint account had existed for 11 years. Regular transfers had moved between it and Daniel's personal account. Not enormous amounts individually, but substantial over time. My mother had been quietly supplementing Daniel's income for over a decade. His mortgage, a business venture that had failed, private school fees for the kids. She had told me none of it. She had asked me to sacrifice 6 years of my life while she was simultaneously funding the person who hadn't shown up. I sat with that for a long time. I am still sitting with it, in a way. But I had also found something else. Something my solicitor found almost incidentally while pulling together the full financial picture. A property. A small rental property that had been in my mother's name, registered 31 years ago, that had never been mentioned in the will. An administrative oversight. Unintentional, my solicitor believed. A property that, because it had not been specified in the will, fell to be distributed differently under the rules of intestacy. Daniel didn't know about it. I found that out because I asked, directly and carefully, whether he had been provided the full asset inventory during the will reading. He hadn't. I said nothing. I smiled at his children's birthday party. I brought wine. I said, "This has all been so hard, hasn't it?" And watched him agree. I let another 30 days pass. On a Wednesday morning, ordinary, gray, the kind of day that doesn't announce itself, my solicitor filed the necessary paperwork to claim the intestate property. I did not call Daniel first. I did not warn him. I had given 6 years of my life to a situation I had not been warned about. I felt we were even on the matter of advance notice. He called me 12 days later. He had been speaking with his own solicitor by that point. His voice was different. Not angry, not immediately. Carefully neutral, the way voices go when someone is managing themselves very hard. He said he had heard about the property. He said he wanted to understand what I was doing. I said, "I'm making sure everything is accounted for accurately. That's all." He said, "I thought you weren't angry." I said, "I'm not." There was a silence between us that lasted a long time. The kind of silence where both people understand that something has shifted permanently, and neither one is willing to be the first to name it. He brought up my mother. He said she had made her wishes clear. I said I agreed. She had made many things very clear, in retrospect. He heard the weight in that. I could tell by the pause that followed. He said, "You've been planning this." I said, "I've been reading. There's a difference." The property was mine, legally and cleanly, 6 weeks later. It was not a fortune. I want to be precise about that. It did not balance the accounting. Nothing could balance the accounting. What it did was something more important. It meant that I had not simply absorbed what was done to me. It meant that I had looked at the full picture with all the lights on, and I had made sure that every last thing in that room was accounted for. I still think about the bathroom floor, the rain outside the window on that November morning, my mother's hand in mine. I don't know what she was trying to do. I'm not sure I ever will. Whether she was protecting Daniel in the way she had always protected him from things, or whether the 6 years had simply not weighed on her the way they had weighed on me, or whether she had convinced herself, quietly, over a long time, that love doesn't need to be equitable to be real. I have turned it over many times. I have not yet found the bottom of it. If my story stayed with you, if something in it felt familiar, you're not alone. Subscribe to Vengeance Verity. I share a new story every week. Real pain, real silence, real justice. And if this one hits something deep inside you, hit the like button. Share it with someone who would understand. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is let someone else know they're not alone either.